second lunch and learn for the season. My name is Helen Lansdowne and I'm at the Centre, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our lunch and learn that's being given by a visiting scholar from India, Rinku Lamba. Rinku, she's here for 4 months, 5 months, and we're sharing her with the Centre for the Studies in Religion and Society. I'm very excited to have her here. She's participating in a conference that's coming up that the two centres are doing on religious diversity in India, China, and Canada. So today Rinku is going to give us a talk, Reflections on the Indian Variant of Liberalism. She comes from JNU, from the Centre for Political Studies, and she got her PhD from U of T. Come back to Canada. So over to you, Rinku.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks to Kathy and to CSRS for letting me here for these months and to share my work and have exchanges with colleagues here. There is a little bit of a change in the content of my talk compared to what I intended for it to be, although it continues to be within the same thematic that the title seems to suggest, which is Reflections on the Indian Variant of Liberalism. And perhaps what I'll do is first mention how what I'm talking about today fits into the larger question associated with Indian liberalism, and then get on to the details of today's presentation itself. So what I want to do in my What is a Book project is underscore the idea that during the anti-colonial struggle in modern India, so in the 19th and 20th century, so India gets freedom from British rule in 1947, and a whole bit of kind of nationalistic activity starts off mid-19th century, and some might argue even earlier than that. Right? So this is a pretty long period of an anti-colonial struggle which encompasses the entire subcontinent, eventually begins in different parts, and there's leaders traveling everywhere and beginning to speak to each other in languages. And language is facilitated in some ways by the onset of a new system of education. And typically, the historiography of this kind of anti-colonial nationalism, or the dominant historiography, or the dominant account of how to understand anti-colonial nationalism, suggests some kind of lame adoption or imitation or even problematic entrapment of the Indian nationalist intellectual activity under, or it's in, so what is it trapped in? It's trapped in Western modernity, and it's trapped in a certain understanding of liberalism. And so the critique is, look at how successful the colonial system of rule was, because eventually Indians gave to themselves a liberal democratic constitution that resembles pretty much notions of rule that have emerged in the modern West. So that's the dominant critique, the dominant historiography of Indian nationalism then is critical of the way in which the nationalist elite is assumed to have not been too creative in the way it engages ideas. And they don't blame the nationalists for not being creative, they just suggest that the hegemony of the other set of ideas is so strong that the encounter results in an unwitting adoption by the colonized of a model which appears to come from somewhere else. So there are critiques that suggest that this model of rule is alien to the Indian life world. And so critiques of liberalism go hand in hand with critiques of Indian secularism. You can even say that the way in which secularism plays itself out in modern India is basically the way in which liberalism unfolds elsewhere. It's about what to do with religious diversity and how to address not just inter-group domination, so competition among Hindus or Muslims, Christians or Sikhs, etc., but also, and here's where I want to mention how my project's kind of different from the dominant historiography, to suggest that a lot of the activity during the anti-colonial struggle in India was not only posited against the colonial configuration of power. So it's not just the hegemon from the outside that is sought to be resisted, but rather there is also active engagement with local configurations of power, seen in the form of sex-based and caste-based hierarchies which were associated with religions like Hinduism, for example. So I want to suggest in my work that if we want to understand the intellectual history for why India has a certain kind of liberal, democratic, secular model in 1947, adopted in 1950, when India gave to itself its own constitution, I suggest that we need to go back to debates in the 19th and the 20th centuries during the anti-colonial struggle, which were debates engaging not just colonial power, but also, as I pointed out, local configurations of power that needed to be offset through certain arrangements, which then seem to come very easily in the form of the liberal instrumentalities of law and state. Right? So it seems like this engagement with intra-group domination that many Indians had with regard to their own religious or social forms results in the endorsement of institutional arrangements typically associated with liberalism, law and state, as a way by which to offset power hierarchies. Right? It's also, we should notice, a liberalism that's not the kind of Rawlsian liberalism that we think about today, which is kind of more and more current since the 1970s. It's a different idea of liberalism, and it's in tandem with the history of liberalism as basically an assertion against despotism, against arbitrary power. Right? So you have to kind of understand the broader history of liberalism itself. And then the suggestion that I would advance following the work of scholars like Sudipto Kaviraj and Rajiv Bhargav is that doctrines such as liberalism and unwitting adoption by the colonized of a model which appears to come from somewhere else. So there are critiques that suggest that this model of rule is alien to the Indian life world. And so critiques of liberalism go hand in hand with critiques of Indian secularism. You can even say that the way in which secularism plays itself out in modern India is basically the way in which liberalism unfolds elsewhere. It's about what to do with religious diversity and how to address not just inter-group domination, so competition among Hindus or Muslims, Christians or Sikhs, etc., but also, and here's where I want to mention how my project's kind of different from the dominant historiography, is to suggest that a lot of the activity during the anti-colonial struggle in India was not only posited against the colonial configuration of power. So it's not just the hegemon from the outside that is sought to be resisted, but rather there is also active engagement with local configurations of power, seen in the form of sex-based and caste-based hierarchies which were associated with religions like Hinduism, for example. So I want to suggest in my work that if we want to understand the intellectual history for why India has a certain kind of liberal, democratic, secular model in 1947, adopted in 1950, when India gave to itself its own constitution, I suggest that we need to go back to debates in the 19th and the 20th centuries during the anti-colonial struggle, which were debates engaging not just colonial power, but also, as I pointed out, local configurations of power that needed to be offset through certain arrangements, which then seem to come very easily in the form of the liberal instrumentalities of law and state. Right? So it seems like this engagement with intra-group domination that many Indians had with regard to their own religious or social forms results in the endorsement of institutional arrangements typically associated with liberalism, law and state, as a way by which to offset power hierarchies. Right? It's also, we should notice, a liberalism that's not the kind of Rawlsian liberalism that we think about today, which is kind of more and more current since the 1970s. It's a different idea of liberalism, and it's in tandem with the history of liberalism as basically an assertion against despotism, against arbitrary power. Right? So you have to kind of understand the broader history of liberalism itself. And then the suggestion that I would advance following the work of scholars like Sudipto Kaviraj and Rajiv Bhargav is that doctrines such as liberalism and secularism arise or may have originated historically in the West at a particular moment, but their lives and their trajectories have to be understood through their journey across space and time. Right? So we have to be open to the idea that notions of liberalism and secularism can result in very many different institutional formations. And the Indian liberal secular democratic state is one kind of formation that results from a happy adoption of certain ideas associated with the liberal modern West. Right? So that's the broader kind of background to what I'm up to. And more specifically today, today, I want to outline the arguments that B.R. Ambedkar offers for a certain kind of interventionist model of secularism. So who is Ambedkar? He is somebody who lives between 1890 and 1956. He's an Indian person who belongs in the category of people known as the untouchables, somebody who experiences being treated as a pariah on a regular basis, but someone who was also able to get scholarships and study in different places, including outside of India. He was trained as a lawyer and he's quite influenced by the writings of John Dewey. And he's also someone who says that the Buddha and Kabir and another intellectual activist in India called Phule were some of his primary influences, or were the primary influences on his thought. So Ambedkar is this person who belongs to what is today called the group that's called Dalits, right, which is outside the caste order. They're designated to be outside, and they have been victims of this practice of untouchability, which is pretty central to Hinduism in the way it has evolved over time. Ambedkar goes on to become the chairperson of the drafting committee of the Constituent Assembly that wrote the Indian Constitution, so he's pretty influential in his own way in terms of being able to contribute to debates. He was invited by Gandhi and Nehru to take up that position. Gandhi and Nehru were his interlocutors during the entire struggle against colonialism that was going on up to 1947. Right? So I want to focus on Ambedkar's ideas today a little bit and give us a sense of where does the Indian ease, the ease with which the constitutional structure of modern India kind of facilitates state intervention in the reform of religion. And I want to ask, what is where does this idea come from? What is the intellectual history behind it? And I think Ambedkar's thought supplies us with resources to think about it. He's not the only person we can rely on. I think there's a trajectory of thought preceding him. There's individuals like Phule and Ranade, whose thought I will not focus on today, who contributed in still different ways to thinking about the need for state intervention in social reform, social-religious reform. So today I want to focus on Ambedkar, and I'm going to try and not race through, so I'll try and speak slowly, but I want to also give us a sense of what it is that Ambedkar is writing about. And I think he's a fantastic thinker who should be reckoned with in spaces outside of just anti-caste movements as well. And more he's being recognized as someone who had a vision of democracy, fortunately. And so there's no need to ghettoize him as just a Dalit thinker. I think there's much more to him, and a trajectory of thought that he joins up with in colonial India that can help us to understand the way in which Indians gave to themselves a certain kind of liberal democratic model of rule.
Excuse me, would you mind writing his name on
Sure
the
thing.
board for someone not familiar with his work but wants to read about it?
If I write here, is it visible?
That's right.
Okay, and his initials are B&R. And the exact dates are 1891 to 1956. His writings are now very nicely accessible through a website that Columbia University has set up. So you can just do Ambedkar Writings, Columbia University, and there's a fair amount of his very interesting thought that's now so accessible. And he wrote a lot in English, so you're not even relying on translations. At least great fun to read. So I strongly encourage all of us to spend some time in our lives at some point to read a little bit of what he says. Okay. So an oft-disputed feature of secularism in independent India is the constitutional mandate of the state to intervene in religion. Article 25(2)(b) of the Indian Constitution permits the state to intervene in religious reform for social welfare and to ensure that Hindu religious institutions of a public character are open to all classes and sections of Hindu. So prior to this, Dalits would not be permitted entry into a number of temples, for example, into a number of Hindu temples. But the state has allowed, the constitution allows the state to make laws that can control what temples and temple administrators can do. Similarly, Article 17 of the Indian Constitution involves direct intervention in religion since it abolishes the practice in any form of untouchability, which arguably is a central feature of the caste system endorsed by a certain model of Hinduism. Articles 17 and 25(2)(b) are cited when critics of Indian secularism point out the anomalous features of Indian secularism. In the view of these critics, such provisions contravene the principle of neutrality that undergirds a strict separation of state and religion, which in turn is supposed to be the core element of the doctrine of secularism according to these critics. The perceived lack of fit between the requirements of neutrality and the Indian practice of state intervention in the reform of Hinduism has even led some theorists like Partho Chatterjee to question the feasibility of the doctrine of secularism in modern India. A more recent critique has emerged in an article in an influential political science journal last year in Political Theory, where a set of scholars working in the Netherlands have buttressed this idea of secularism being unsuitable by suggesting that liberalism and secularism need for their sustenance a cultural worldview that is predominantly Western, and when these ideas migrate into spaces such as India, they are not going to take roots. They're just going to be alien impositions because they don't have those roots or the soil that's required to nurture them in the way those critics think is necessary. This is just to say that the critique of Indian secularism has, as Professor Lamba was saying the other day, a kind of continuous life. It's been there in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and dominant intellectuals in India have fixed positions on how secularism is quite problematic as an ideology imposed upon a space like India. Luckily though, there's also a group of scholars that's been steadily and reasonably and very persuasively resisting this. This paper highlights aspects of the intellectual history that can explain the adoption in independent India of constitutional clauses such as the one that I just mentioned, which allow the state to intervene in matters related to Hinduism for the sake of social welfare and reform, through an analysis of the political thought of B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar was a key, though sometimes lone, political thinker in colonial India. He sparred a lot with Gandhi, by the way. So he's a political thinker in colonial India, influential in fashioning the political institution structure of post-colonial India. He was one of the chief architects of independent India's liberal democratic constitution. As I mentioned, born into the lowest rung of the Hindu caste order, he overcame numerous social and financial obstacles to educate himself, earning his law and doctoral degrees from the London School of Economics and Columbia University, and stoutly and systematically resisted multiple forms of domination inflicted by the caste system in India. For Ambedkar, religiously sanctioned caste inequalities constituted the chief obstacle to the attainment of democratic freedom in modern India. This is the point I want to stress today, that his animus toward caste is not just something to be understood along the axes of majority-minority politics, but rather as something that is, he suggests that if caste practice continues the way it appears to be, which is separating people from each other, he says there's a serious problem for democracy in India. Anyone who practices caste is going to suffer from a democratic point of view, and I will try and explain why he thought so. So that's the point I want us to keep in mind, and not just think of Ambedkar as a Dalit intellectual, or a minority representative who was arguing for affirmative action for the Dalits, which he was successful in arguing for, by the way. So I think we need to just kind of broaden our vision about how we even think about Ambedkar. So religiously sanctioned caste inequalities constituted a chief obstacle to the attainment of democratic freedom in modern India. To address the comprehensive injustices sustained by the caste order, Ambedkar endorsed a centralized, law-governed order for modern India, characterized by robustly representative political institutions that would not ignore minorities, and often he argued for separate electorates for the Dalits. He also argued for state ownership of agricultural land so that members of the lower castes were not systematically disadvantaged in the ownership of a vital means of production. He ardently supported the Indian state's role in reforming religion-based personal laws in India. For Ambedkar, the above arrangements were required to address injustice and to pursue the values of freedom, equality, and fraternity. So I want to highlight today Ambedkar's views on the reform of Hinduism, which he considers to be a religion of rules. So he makes a distinction between religion of rules and a religion of principles. A religion of rules is one that expects or which somehow is able to have its adherents follow certain notions mechanically without applying a sense of reflexivity on the part of the adherent of the religion. So that's a religion of rules, and he associates Hinduism with being a certain kind of religion of rules. Instead, he's not saying, so what is he saying when he sees a phenomenon like Hinduism? He's not suggesting that, because there is such a religion of rules, we need to get rid of religion altogether. Instead, he suggests that we can pay attention to something that he calls a religion of principles. So, a religion of rules is one that fixes for its adherents habitual ways of doing things according to prescription, such that they do not need to exercise responsibility or judgment while enacting a religious precept. So the rule may be right, but the act is mechanical when one is acting within a framework of religion of rules. Instead, Ambedkar advocates a religion of principles, which alone can lay claim to being, he says, a true religion. While rules are practical, principles are intellectual, he says. He says principles are useful methods for judging things. A rule prescribes a specific course of action, but a principle does not. A principle may be wrong, but the acts that flow from its observance could still be classified as conscious and responsible. Moreover, a religious act may not be a correct act, but must at least be a responsible act. That was a quotation from him. Even more strictly for Ambedkar, Hinduism's rule-bound nature ultimately disqualified it from being classified as a religion. What the Hindus call religion is really, he says, law or at best legalized class ethics. To quote him, he says, frankly, I refuse to call this code of ordinances as religion. If Hinduism truly was a religion, it would not deprive its adherents of a moral life of freedom and spontaneity, and it would not reduce them to a more or less anxious and servile conformity to externally imposed rules. But the worst aspect of Hinduism as a religion of rules for Ambedkar was that it sanctioned an iniquitous social scheme as the work of prophets or lawgivers, and therefore deemed that scheme as final and fixed. The immutability attributed to its sectarian schemes cramped and crippled Hinduism's adherents, says Ambedkar, depriving them of their humanity by forcing them to live by codes of conduct unsuited to conditions and circumstances that varied for different people and epochs. As long as a caste-based scheme enjoyed the status of religion, its adherents would be wary of bringing about any change because, says Ambedkar, the idea of religion is generally speaking not associated with the idea of change. End of quote. So what I want to suggest as I go on now is that the way Ambedkar understands caste, the way he thinks the structure of caste plays itself out within the Hindu social order, is such that there is very little possibility of internal change coming about from within Hinduism. So that's one aspect of what I will mention. So the point here is that there's something inherent in the structure of caste which precludes the possibility of internally generated reform, requiring thereby reliance on an external entity to do that kind of reform. And that external entity for Ambedkar would be the law and the state. And that's one aspect of Ambedkar's views. But the other question, and that's the primary question, is that why should we be reforming religion? What is it that caste is impeding? What is it that is important if we want to be a democratic political community, which the presence of caste hinders the pursuit of? Right? So this is what I'm going to, I guess, move on to talking about straight away, because I see time is going by. Ambedkar held that one principal problem with the caste system was that it destroyed public spirit, and any sense of public charity. A narrow sense of belonging to one caste, says Ambedkar, has the consequence of restricting each person's sense of charity and appreciation of merit to those inside his or her caste group alone. To quote him, suffering as such calls for no response. There is sympathy, but not for men of other caste. End of quote. This sectarian disposition of caste then precludes the development of fraternity, which Ambedkar posits as a feature of an ideal democratic society. Ambedkar's explication of fraternity distinguishes between democracy as a form of government and as a mode of associated living. So to quote him again, democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence toward fellow men. End of quote. The crucial point in this commentary on democracy is his firm belief in the necessity for opportunities to have communicated experience, the importance of points of contact and possibilities of interaction between different groups which exist within it. It's not that the plurality of distinctive or diverse groups, even within a particular religion, appear to be of concern to Ambedkar in his considerations on the requirements of democratic political community. So what Ambedkar is suggesting is that the presence of caste in the Hindu social order is not allowing for a certain kind of commingling among different people who can then arrive at some kind of a common vision, and he talks about things in common, and I'm going to quote from him in a briefly. So what he's suggesting that groupism of the type that caste perpetuates is very different from other types of groupism. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that in his hostility to caste as a form of group arrangement, Ambedkar is not simultaneously suggesting a reticence toward group life in general. He in fact very much appreciates the importance for individuals to be in a social setting, and he's afraid of individuals who might be excommunicated because of caste rules and therefore rendered solitary. Right? He understands, I think, so I haven't developed the point here yet, but I think it can be developed. Ambedkar is very much tuned into the importance of group life, of doing things together. Right? He does understand, so social settings are very important for him, for persons to be able to develop in a certain way. He does not have an atomistic view of individuals, is what I'm trying to suggest. And at the same time, groups like the way in which caste organizes groups, which is discrete entities which are not allowed to mingle so much with each other, neither intermarry nor even eat together, not sharing food, for example, and other forms of distinction that are meeting. That kind of groupism is problematic for Ambedkar. So he spends some time explaining to the reader that he's not arguing against groups per se, but he's arguing against the kinds of group fostered by caste. So let me just quote a little bit more about what kind of groups he's thinking of in an ideal situation. And this is the longish quotation. The questions to be asked in determining whether a given society is an ideal society is not whether there are groups in it, because groups exist in all societies. The question to be asked in determining what is an ideal society are, how numerous and varied are the interests which are consciously shared by the groups? How full and free is the interplay with other forms of associations? Are the forces that separate groups and classes more numerous than the forces that unite? So he wants us to ask these kinds of questions before we settle down on what kinds of groups we are eventually going to be looking forward to seeing in an ideal democratic situation. Ambedkar did not systematically address each of these questions, that quotation ended there that way, but they serve as a framework to differentiate between caste in Hinduism and caste in Christianity, Islam and Sikhism, and for him to conclude that the existence of caste groups within other religions did not provide grounds to condone their presence within Hinduism. The groupism spawned by the Hindu caste system went beyond the acceptable limits of group-specific ways of being, and Hindu religion sanctioned and thus entrenched group life in a way that could yield undemocratic consequences. So Helen, can I take another 5-6 minutes?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just going to quote a little bit more from Ambedkar to give a sense of what else it is that caste seems to be impeding. So caste-type groups are not allowing for the ideal kind of group life to exist, that's one thing. But what else is happening in these ideal kinds of group condition which caste is thwarting the possibility for? I'm going to kind of spell that out a little bit. In his deliberations on caste, Ambedkar advances the claim that Hindu society as such does not exist. It was merely a collection of castes, he says. The segregated existence encouraged by caste resulted in Hindus lacking consciousness of kind. Indians, therefore, he says, especially given that it's a majority Hindu population, did not constitute a nation or a society, and he uses these terms interchangeably. The occurrence of and this is interesting, some of what he says now in terms of how to understand what again would be an ideal situation. The occurrence of similarities in habits and customs across the subcontinent could not fulfill, he says, the requirements for qualifying to be a society or a nation. Quote, men do not become a society by living in physical proximity, any more than a man ceases to be a member of his society by living so many miles away from other men. End of quote. Ambedkar believed that culture spread by diffusion, so that when the habits, customs, beliefs and thought of one group are taken on by another group, there may appear to be a similarity between the two. But, and this is important, the longish quote again, similarity in certain things is not enough to constitute a society. Men constitute a society because they have things which they possess in common. To have similar things is totally different from possessing things in common. And the only way by which men can come to possess things in common with one another is by being in communication with one another. For that purpose, and I'm continuing to quote him, for that purpose what is necessary is for a man to share and participate in a common activity so that the same emotions are aroused in him that animate the others. Making the individual a sharer or partner in the associated activity so that he feels its success as his success, its failure as his failure, is the real thing that binds men and makes a society of them. The caste system prevents common activity, and by preventing common activity, it has prevented the Hindus from becoming a society with a unified life and a consciousness of its own being. End of quote. Ambedkar's rather collectivist disposition evident in this quotation above must, however, be viewed alongside his unequivocal commitment to providing individuals the power to resist, was also to be representative of the interests, aims and aspirations of all the various groups involved. When left to themselves, individual groups create their own distinctive variety of what Ambedkar calls like-mindedness. Persons, he says, come to be like-minded within their group through participating in the activities of that group. Like-mindedness among or between groups, so essential for a harmonious life, social or political, depended upon there being possibilities for contact among these groups. He calls it the process of endosmosis. Endosmosis renders possible a re-socialization of attitudes that could have come because of isolation. So in arguing for common action that could generate sympathetic like-mindedness. So like-mindedness can exist within the group, because I think like my fellow members within the group, in spite of some heterogeneity within the group even, we can perhaps arrive at some sense of a common vision through various forms. But he's suggesting like-mindedness to somehow be constructed among groups, not just within groups. And not just like-mindedness, but also sympathetic like-mindedness. So this is in tandem with this. I think he's okay. I'm not going to. I think if there are questions about this, we can talk about it in discussion. So I'm going to conclude in 2-3 minutes now. I think I might have given you a glimpse of at least what Ambedkar is hoping would exist in an ideal situation. The presence of the caste order is a problem when it comes to moving India in the direction of an ideal political community. One where there would be a certain kind of common vision or a sense of doing things together in spite of being in different groups. Right? And he does value the presence of groups per se. He doesn't think of isolated individuals somehow aggregating together. And And then the part that I will not dwell on, but I will quickly mention now, is that if India has to become this kind of community where caste is not going to pose such impediments, then there has to be some kind of reform of the Hindu social order. So he's quite attuned to the fact that there can be public and private forms of government. Right? I'm sure you all know that. And that's one of liberalism's concerns as well, which is to secure personal liberty, or to secure the liberty for persons against government of the private and the public variety, any concentration of power. And inasmuch as caste represents a certain kind of concentration of power, it has to be addressed. But the caste structure, which he calls a system of graded sovereignties, by which he suggests the sociology of caste in some ways, that every caste tends to have some caste below it, the way the caste system is organized. And so the psychology that results from that is that no caste is ever going to allow the caste just below it to arise above it, to come above it. Because each little occupant of the hierarchical system has some privileges, which are different from the one that are below them in the order. So internal to the caste structures, graded sovereignties as he calls them, is this inability for there to be internal resistance to caste. And the price of asking for reform was pretty high as well in the way Ambedkar is seeing it. I have to point out here that in his critique of caste, Ambedkar is sometimes reproducing colonial discourse. So I mean, that's something we can also think about if it arises in the Q&A time. And at the same time, he is able to hit the nail on the head when it comes to identifying the difficulty of those that are in the lowest round. I mean, his point appears to be demonstrable even today in today's politics, not just politics, but in the way in which social life unfolds itself. Castes above the lowest and the ones who are pariah are not interested in seeing them rising. I think there's something there to be said about just the way in which power acts itself out in situations where I think it's more about power. It's not just about class, and there is a sense in which people want there to be someone who's really at the bottom. And when people from that group try and do something, and they're trying and there's change, I'm not suggesting it's remained an unchanged order at all, but it's difficult. And so I think even though Ambedkar might be reproducing a colonial discourse in the way he presents caste as, some kind of frame through which to understand everything that goes on in India, I think while we can temper that a little bit, he is onto something when he suggests that internal to the structure is a difficulty for any kind of alliance building, which will allow some to do what's necessary to critically change the system from within. Right? So graded sovereignties is the reason why he thinks internally there can be no such reform of this private form of power. And therefore he recommends that changes to the way in which key activities are carried out within Hinduism should be brought about by law and state, by some external entity basically, something that's not Hindu, because Hindu law has to be reformed and you can't leave it to the Hindu social order to do it, is what he's suggesting. And these views of his are represented not just in his writings, this is from a lot of what I read out today is from his piece called The Annihilation of Caste, which is available on our website as well, as I pointed out. But also, these views, they surface every time he makes an appearance to argue for separate electorates for the depressed classes, as he calls them, for the Dalits, during the colonial regime in India. Right? So he's basically arguing for affirmative actions, argues first for separate electorates, but then he settles for reserved electorates because of the dispute with Gandhi. And the point he's trying to make there is that representative forums need to be filled also, or need to be designed in such a way that they make this kind of conjointed communication possible. So it's a point that he makes in different ways when he argues for schemes of representation on which he really dwelt a great deal. So I think I should stop with that, and I'd be happy to engage in some discussion over points that we have already explored. Thanks.
Thank you.